Hello, good evening, and welcome back to another episode of Minds on Guard, where we're learning how to guard our minds against all of the manipulations, attacks, and attempts at both thought and behavior control that we come under today in the 21st century. Tonight, we are going to continue our look at the book People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil by Dr. M. Scott Peck. We're in the middle of a series on a sort of phenomenon that's a creeping normalization of narcissism that is happening all over, at least in America and pretty much all of the developed world, where social media is a major portion of our cultural landscape today. So far, we've touched on the implications of a severe personality disorder becoming what's called normative in society, the various kinds of narcissistic supply that people seek, as well as the specific traits that a person must have in order to be diagnosed as having narcissistic personality disorder. In our discussion of People of the Lie, I'm attempting to highlight the very serious nature of these kinds of disorders and how they actually cross a metaphysical line where normal, broken human behavior takes on a deeper, more malicious and sinister form and actually becomes qualifiable evil. This will be the third video where we spend some time with this book, so if you have not yet watched the first two videos, please go back and do so, as well as the other material that I've made on narcissism. Dr. Peck's work is very important as it really brings the subject of severe personality disorder into what I think is its fuller context by allowing aspects of the supernatural into an area of study and research that typically forbids that kind of thinking. We have discussed many times on this channel that to think about anything without the proper contextual frame is really not a solid way to go about the effort of discerning truth. When we lack information on any aspect of reality, we really cannot understand reality to the best of our ability. There could be any number of reasons for there to be a less than ideal contextual frame around any area of study, but as thinking people who are focused on the truth, it's our responsibility to make sure that we're working with as full a picture as we possibly can. If we remove certain aspects of reality from the discussion or study from the start, like, say, the supernatural, we're left to really only rely on heuristics, and then we set ourselves up for failure because things in reality very rarely behave in any kind of isolation, especially when it comes to human behavior and psychology. Just because something makes us uncomfortable or presses on our worldview in ways that challenge our preconceived notions or what we would like to be true, doesn't mean that those things aren't true or integral to our study. Often those reactions point to an area that we need to dig into even more. Likewise, we need to guard against lazy thinking and make sure that we don't miss things simply because they are not readily apparent at a surface level examination of a topic. I'm really speaking in terms of how we should study and think about these deeper concepts so that we can make connections across wider ranges and areas of our studies. When it comes to reading a text, every writer will be working with a worldview that underpins the logic of their ideas and observations. It is up to us as readers to engage with how the writer thinks and sees the world so that we may understand them as they desire to be understood. Now, I could say quite a lot more on that, but for now, as we work through this book and these ideas, let's all try our best to think beyond the first thing we see and then dig deeper to think about these things with the proper contextual frame. To do that, we're going to pick up where we left off in last week's video with a quote from Erich Fromm. Fromm writes, "Our capacity to choose changes constantly with our practice of life. The longer we continue to make the wrong decisions, the more our heart hardens. The more often we make the right decision, the more our heart softens, or better perhaps, comes alive. I spoke last week about our choice when it comes to our behavior and ultimately whose will we serve in our daily life. We have been created with free will. Freedom of choice allows for a great deal of good to be carried out in the world, but it also means that the same is true for the amount of evil that may be wrought. I really appreciate the way that Fromm speaks of this act of choosing as our practice of life. His sentiment here is biblically sound and amplifies what we understand to be the process of sanctification when we are living in submission to God and His will above our own. We see time and time again in Scripture and in many other places that whenever people choose against God, the consequence of a hardened heart towards His will follows right after. People become cold and self-righteous until eventually they live with a hatred of all that comes from the true source of goodness and love in the world. This may be thought of as a kind of slow death, which, if the behavior is not repented of, leads to true death in the gravest sense of the term, that being cut off in complete estrangement from God for all eternity. I'm sure we can all think of examples of the kinds of thinking and behavior that would lead to this hardness of heart. Bitterness, self-aggrandizing, arrogant, angry people who care little for others and seek to advantage themselves in every single area of life, no matter how small or great the impact to others may be. On the flip side, when we practice love and placing others before ourselves, we learn what it means to submit our will in service of another, not for personal gain, but out of love. Our focus should be on serving God's will above all others, and we can practice this in every single relationship and interaction that we have. By realizing our shared humanity as imagers of God created to steward and look after one another as well as our surroundings, we gain life more and more. Fromm speaks true that a softening of our heart is like coming alive. It is in choosing to serve the will of God where true freedom is actually found, because we are no longer bound up in the morass and dysfunction of evil and selfish thinking. Beauty is discovered, peace is maintained, our intellects and creative spirit are given space to grow and flourish, and the kingdom of God is expanded through each individual. I know from personal experience that the darkness that follows a hardened heart leads to nothing but ensuring that we stay locked in the chains of pain and misery that are of our own design. We have become a slave to our own selfish desires, and we cannot see any other way. That is the consequence of placing our will over that of God's. As Fromm says, each step in life which increases my self-confidence, my integrity, my courage, my conviction also increases my capacity to choose the desirable alternative, until eventually it becomes more difficult for me to choose the undesirable rather than the desirable action. On the other hand, each act of surrender and cowardice weakens me, opens the path for more acts of surrender, and eventually freedom is lost. We all have a choice of what kind of life we wish to practice, that of life or that of death. Choose life, my friends. The next part of the quote from Fromm says, "Between the extreme when I can no longer do a wrong act and the extreme when I have lost my freedom to right action, there are innumerable degrees of freedom of choice. In the practice of life, the degree of freedom to choose is different at any given moment. If the degree of freedom to choose the good is great, it needs less effort to choose the good. If it is small, it takes a great effort, help from others, and favorable circumstances." I really like this quote because it highlights a really particularly special part of Jesus' teaching. In the book of Matthew, chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, we read, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." This is the truth of the Christian walk and the fruit of choosing to serve God's will. Often people think that living in service means losing some kind of freedom. But in reality, just the opposite is found in serving Christ over ourselves. In truth, we are far less free when we are not choosing the good, and wind up enslaved to sin and evil. This only turns to more and more of the same when we don't submit ourselves to the yoke of Christ. Dress it up in any fancy or clever disguise you want, it all winds up serving our selfish desires for control, which leads to bondage in sin. On the contrary, real humility in submission, gentleness, and love truly does yield peace and rest, and in that we actually gain more and more depth to our life that only comes from relationship with the Most High God. I want to encourage anyone watching who does not have a relationship with Jesus to call out to Him in prayer and seek to learn who He is and why you need Him in your life. Again, from Fromm, most people fail in the art of living not because they are inherently bad or so without will that they cannot lead a better life. They fail because they do not wake up and see when they stand at a fork in the road and have to decide. They are not aware when life asks them a question and when they still have alternative answers. Then with each step along the wrong road, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to admit that they are on the wrong road, often only because they have to admit that they must go back to the first wrong turn and must accept the fact that they have wasted energy and time. This encapsulates the same sentiment as before, only now we see one of the major errors in thinking that we have discussed in other videos come into this concept of choosing to live for good or for evil. The sunk cost fallacy becomes a death sentence when we react to the truth of our choices with fear and refuse to correct course. Now, the sunk cost fallacy is the tendency for people to continue an endeavor or course of action even when abandoning it would be more beneficial. This thinking error perpetuates evil by us giving up the responsibility to our own choices and appeal to objective truth over what we wish to be true. If you have not yet seen the videos on the sunk cost fallacy, please go back and watch them. With respect to people of the lie, this thinking error is a significant component as to why people always seem to get worse and worse in their narcissism and their evil behavior. Hopefully, by learning about the ways in which all of these things intertwine and work in and on our thinking, we can learn to spot the times where we are giving up control of our choices and our freedom to choose the good and stay on the side of health and light. Very often, it's when people become lazy and complacent that the scapegoating and abdication of responsibility take over, and evil is allowed to continue. In upcoming videos, we're going to examine how this happens at group levels in order to make connections to the kinds of rampant narcissism and the normalization of that personality disorder that we see so much of in today's media and popular culture. Until next time, stay safe, stay diligent, and stay vigilant, keeping your minds on guard.